moving again. The topic for today is orgasm and society. I thought that would get people's attention, but it is less. It's actually less dramatic than the title sounds. Again, for those of you who haven't been here before, I want to thank David Silver, whose loft we're holding these sessions in, these lectures in, for his hospitality and his support. And this is ongoing into our 15th year, and I'm not sure. The next topic will be death, an orgonomic perspective. I'm not sure if that's the last or just the beginning.
Maybe you'll get a bigger crowd.
Maybe, I don't know. I have given up predicting what of these lectures draws people. I assumed last go round when I did the lecture on play, that was purely to indulge my own interests in play and play theory and play, the study of play, and it brought in a huge, for us, a large group of people interested in it. So who knows? We'll see. I guess everybody. Besides, I figured we would do spring on sex and death. Maybe there's some logic to that on some level.
Or we could just watch a Woody Allen movie.
We could watch a Woody Allen movie, except he didn't quite get it.
Right.
You know, that's his whole problem. He always says he never quite gets it. Anyway, so Orgasm and Society, and Dr. Schiff, for those of you who don't know, is here via hookup to via satellite, via hookup to Seattle by phone. Okay. Well, I want to start out with, to begin with, I think there are a number of issues that have to be looked at in this, and actually my primary interest in doing this topic and looking at this was really something that emerged from my work with patients, my clinical work, as well as my scholarly research, which is, and my popular reading in terms of the way society deals with issues of sexuality. And it seemed to me that one of the primary things is that there are profound misunderstandings, first of all, about what Reich was talking about when he talked about orgasm and its function. And there, not only today, but there were always profound misunderstandings, even among those people who worked closely with him and thought they were involved, clearly with his work and discoveries. And secondly, that as Reich always said, you have to look at institutions that exist in the society and patterns in the society, and rather than simply dismissing them as sick or pathological, you have to look for the reason these institutions survive and function and what they accomplish for the society. That problems with any kind of behavior in the society are not just bad, or they shouldn't be villainized as much as understood. So that in that sense, Reich comes always as a scientist and a pathologist in terms of trying to understand what the pathology tells us about normal function, as well as about ways of dealing with the pathology. So the first thing to understand is what Reich means by orgasm, or the function of the orgasm. And again, it's always worth repeating that it really starts with a fundamental understanding and insight into the nature of pulsation, or pulsation in nature. Again, and on the simplest terms, pulsation is essentially expansion and contraction, or depending on your connection to astrophysics, or cosmology, possibly first contraction, then expansion. Depends, where you come in on it. But the idea that all matter, really, and certainly living matter, functions in a process of expansion and contraction, simple pulsation. When Reich began to examine the nature of living matter and the nature of pulsation as it operates in nature, eventually he came to see this as consistent with what Freud originally articulated as the pleasure principle. But essentially, he connected it clearly to the process of tension the buildup of tension, right, to a peak, to an acme, to a discharge of tension, to a return to rest or ease or relaxation, or as I always like to call it, the big ah. Okay? So the simple, again, for many of you have heard this many times or dealt with it many times. In the simplest terms, this is the bladder analogy of an empty bladder that begins to be filled with fluid, and as it builds and fills, eventually it's going to reach its capacity and will either burst unless it's allowed to discharge and return to a relaxed state, or at least a acceptably extreme state. Okay, and as you all know that, and usually whenever I mention that, people begin to eye the bathroom. If I do when I'm really working with a class, somebody invariably gets up and decides it's time to go to the bathroom. But we all know that, and we all know that sound when someone runs into the bathroom and you hear the and in the very, very simplest terms, that's the orgasm. Okay? It's not that much more complicated than that. Part of the reason I think that Reich always got into trouble was in a sense, and he himself said that, is he was describing not only a fundamental, aspect of nature, but something that is almost so simple it's silly. People that often when I give that analogy, you'll get people who haven't done this work or haven't been involved in it, who think that, oh, it can't be that easy, or that's silly, or you're making light of it. And sex and orgasm and sexuality is much, much more than that. It's much simpler. And there's the famous exchange about that Reich faced back in the 30s after one of his first trips to Russia, and there was a woman named Vera Schmidt who he worked with, who was a real exponent of his work and worked in the Bolshevik government. And she was under attack, as was Reich, not by the conservatives, but by the Bolsheviks and radicals as trivializing sex. Right? And the common statement was, you still hear this today, is that what you guys want to do is make sex as common as drinking water, as getting a glass of water. And Reich's answer, which I thought was absolutely just exquisite in its simplicity, he said, have you ever been really thirsty? And someone said, yeah, sure. So, and have you ever gotten a glass of water? Yeah. How does it feel when you drink that glass of water? He said, we would be happy if individuals could approach sex that simply, which is you're thirsty, you need, the gratification of that, and you have sex in the same way you would go for a glass of water if you're thirsty. Okay? If, on the other hand, you're drinking water all the time when you're not thirsty, or eating all the time when you're not hungry, then you're going to have other kinds of problems. And in that lies the beginning of the studies of the pathology that develops when this natural and very simple natural function begins to be altered in some way and becomes dysfunctional. So with that background, I think the next thing that really began to interest me in terms of this kind of presentation was the common misconceptions that this model produces, and certainly the common misconceptions that it produces even in our work. And in one sense, I wasn't as interested in doing a lecture, which I've done before, on problems in other models or other ideas about human behavior, human sexuality, as much as looking at problems that exist within the orgonomic frame, within Reich, within the individuals who attempt to interpret or understand or apply Reich's ideas, both clinically as well as in terms of social sciences or politics or social behavior, human behavior, and want to look at the misconceptions that we as professionals or as patients or as interested parties tend to foster. Some of this comes from the very fact of how simple Reich's insight was, and how central the issue of orgasm or sexual function is to our very living nature. And in a sense that there's no one who isn't in some way, I guess, with, it's one of those things, birth, sex, and death. I guess they say birth, money, and death, but, possibly money and sex are related, as Freud pointed out. But certainly sexuality is something that we live with, all the time. And one way or the other, it is something that always hits home, always is common to us all as a species, if not as a phylum, as a group of living organisms. So in that way, the problems are that when Reich began to talk about ways of normalizing or helping to regulate, to help individuals regulate their own sexual function, he raised issues that really disturb people on various levels, depending to some extent on the level of their disturbance to begin with. And clearly, much of Reich's work was, certainly in the 30s and even into the 50s, was focused on how disturbances in this natural pulsation in various ways become embedded or become chronic in individuals. That alone was disturbing, but more significantly, Reich introduced the idea that there might be ways of helping individuals achieve greater access to this normal function. And while you would think, and I think Reich himself thought that people would, rush to his support and open up, programs and change, society in order to institute these simple prophylactic health, policies. In fact, he was very wrong. And what he realized towards the end was that when you're dealing with individuals, as we would say, who are armored, who are already significantly dysfunctional or blocked to one degree or another, that contrary to what would seem reasonable and rational, the organisms resist liberation, resist coming to a self-regulatory experience, and resist to one degree or another, and will resist violently if necessary enough to turn really everything upside down. And one of the problems that first emerges with Reich's work is the reaction, not so much, in one sense you could almost predict the reaction of those people who were deeply opposed. So it's very easy to say, oh, the conservatives or the ultra-reactionaries hear Reich's ideas or see the work that Reich proposes, and they're offended as they were offended by Freud's ideas, and so this is just par for the course. What is more complicated is what happens when you look at the response of many individuals who embrace Reich's ideas. So the idea that with enemies, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. In a sense, much of what happens within the various factions or groups who work with Reich, even when he was alive, he talks about this himself on his tapes and lectures that have been preserved, don't get it or don't understand it, mainly because they themselves can't function, naturally can't function with a great deal of elasticity and ease and access to natural pulsation. And interesting things begin to develop. The first of which I would call the mystification of these ideas. And this leads to what I call the myth in orgonomy, or around Reich's work, both within the work as well as perceptions outside the work, of the big O. That there is this thing that is the orgasm. And that what therapy is involved with and what the work is involved with is getting you to a point where you can have this magnificent, earth-shattering, the day the earth stood still kind of orgasm, the big O. So, and if you don't have that, part of the mystification is that if you don't have that, you're never going to be happy, you're never going to know what life is really about, and you're never going to really be able to achieve an integrated existence, an existence that connects you to nature, and you're going to be miserable, and you have to just live with it, okay? And so in fact, if one really looks at Reich's model and understands it, that is not at all what he's talking about. And he himself never, in any of the literature, talks about the orgasm in that way, nor does he ever propose that it is a curative function in the sense of get the big O and everything falls into place and your life is a simple matter of just, going through, lightly and everything works. In fact, it is in one sense, for Reich, the problem was always that the study of the orgasm got so much attention because people were, basically it would be like the exploration for water when everyone was dying of thirst. It would get a lot of attention. And in a sense, the study of sexuality, of human and natural sexuality and natural functions of energy and pulsation produce extreme reactions because everybody is dying of thirst, of dying of deprivation. And so that the very, very introduction of these ideas, or even the discussion of them, tends to automatically set up processes of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and projection, meaning that we begin to project onto these ideas what we long for. So in much the same way as the person who lives in prison for a long time or is in prison for a long time begins to build up fantasies and ideas of what it's going to be like when they get out. And they finally get out and they realize that, well, it's not exactly what I thought it was going to be, and it's not quite this or it's not quite that, and that in fact very often the fantasies of liberation and the fantasies of getting out are far more exciting and far more appealing and in some ways far more engaging than the reality. The classic with this would be Dr. Sobey, who many of you know, or at least have heard of, would point out at one point where a patient who had reached a final stage and was really what we would call becoming orgastically potent, meaning they were able to experience, even the term makes it sound like, oh, okay, well, here we are, But this woman came in and said, she had met a man and they had begun to embrace, and it was very nice, and she felt better than she had ever felt in her life. But she figured she wasn't, there was still something wrong, and he explored with her, what's wrong? She said, well, there's no, explosions. It's not, wild. And he said, well, what do you feel afterwards? He said, I feel good. It's very nice. I feel good for days. He said, that's an orgasm. You've had an orgasm. She said, no, that's not what an orgasm is supposed to be. And what she had built in her life as to what an orgasm was supposed to be had nothing whatsoever to do with what the natural function of the orgasm is, okay? Which is simply a regulatory device in the organism for maintaining natural pulsation, not some, not what it looks like usually in films. Because most of our images, again, and so this is not just Reich's work, but also how this ties into the whole social presentation of sexuality or orgasm in our society, whether it's in the pornography or within the more erotic range or even in just the artistic range, is that orgasm is somehow a very, very, or good sex is somehow a very, very special, very, very ultimately mystical, out of body experience or something that alters the world. When in fact, what Reich was trying to point out is that sexuality and the function of the orgasm is what doesn't alter the world, is what maintains one's roots in nature, what lets you be in the world. Doesn't take you out of the world. The only thing that takes you out of the world, and we have to find out what that is, and maybe that's the big O, which is the next lecture, death, okay? Which brings us to the issue always with one of the things that is always profoundly disturbing about these kinds of explorations and discussions is that when you get to the natural, to the nature of orgasm or the function of the orgasm, that certainly the process of emptying out and feeling a full relaxation or a full ease represents in many cases a complete loss or as complete a loss of self as one is going to experience while alive. And if that is true, it can often be extremely, if not always, extremely disturbing or threatening and frightening, and represent, in many ways, something akin to loss of self that we would imagine is what happens when we die. The only nice thing about it is suddenly you come back and, I'm not quite there yet. And interestingly, when I have been with people who were at the final stages in dying, and the most interesting anecdotally would be, I can share this because Dr. Sobey talked about it openly. His last wife, Francine Sobey, was dying, and I and some others were asked to spend time with her. And she had been a researcher all of her life, and last time I was with her was extremely interesting in that she was close to death, and she had come pretty much to the point of letting go a couple of times already. And she was lucid, and we were sitting talking, and she immediately wanted to give me a very detailed account of what it felt like. And the descriptions were quite literally descriptions of and she was aware of that. She said it was this sense of everything was just going, and I was about to really be able to just let go, right? And then I didn't. And that was okay, but there was something very, she kept saying there was something very frightening but appealing about it. And it always struck me as very accurate to probably, it rang true to me in terms of what we constantly try to struggle with in terms of what it must be like. And I think these things really deeply connect to our fears, to our need to have some control. And in one sense, our need to have control as individuals, as organisms, really allows us to avoid, or sort of sidestep the really fundamental nature of this function, which is to bring you back to a state of ease. So the mystification, I think, gives us greater control, and it allows us to see or to raise the orgasm to a kind of holy grail, which it was never intended to be in terms of at least Reich's studies and work. And it results in reality in a constant sense of longing and a profound underlying impotence, because one can't ever really have it. And in fact, if one gives up that misconception, or does not embrace that kind of mystical elevation, one can have more and deeper contact with that kind of function. And that, again, that the idea that orgasm equals happiness and health, so that again, the mystification of this is that without the orgasm, you can't be a happy or healthy person. When in fact, you can be there are individuals who are orgastically potent and can have enjoyable, deep sexual contact, who aren't necessarily always healthy, and who aren't necessarily always happy. As a matter of fact, as Reich often says, very often if you're orgastically potent and fairly genital and active, you're often going to be unhappier, because you're living in a world where there are constant reasons to be unhappy and to have unhappy experiences. And if the more open you are, the more intense those unhappy or unpleasant experiences are going to be. So again, it's not a kind of simple correlated orgasm, happy, healthy, okay? And again, now, socially, in terms of society's concept of this, and here we come to the other area that I was interested in, which is that if we see certain patterns or certain ideas about anything that are socially maintained and socially propagated and socially supported and encouraged, then you have to ask yourself, what does this do? Why is this there? What purpose does this serve? And in fact, it might appear that society, with all of its prohibitions against certain aspects of sexuality, tends to be sex negative. More significantly, society fosters a particular idea about sexuality that serves a particular function. What do I mean? So that you get in society presentation of the orgasm, not so much, not so much the mystifying of the big O, as much as orgasm equals being sexy, or equals sex. So that this function that we've just talked about gets really pushed away, and that what gets substituted is the idea of the mechanical function of sex. Okay, and that orgasm in the broader social context, to the extent that it's even dealt with, and certainly in our society it is largely dealt with, becomes really focused on the idea of climax, of coming, of the sexual organs and their function, and particularly mechanical functions. Okay, so that the more you can get an erection, then the more sexually potent you are. When in fact, any one of us who works clinically knows that when an individual comes in, this was always Dr. Sobey's favorite example, was a guy comes in and said, and you ask them, well, how is your love life? How is your sexual life? And the guy says, oh, it's great. I have sex almost every day, and I have 5 or 6 orgasms, and I'm always ready to go, and I can always get an erection. So Dr. Sobey said, well, assuming that you believe him to begin with, the point is what you're treating is not a healthy sexual function. What you're treating is impotence. But in terms of the social ideal and the Masters and Johnson kind of syndrome, which is every erection is a sign of sexual health and sexual function, this guy is Superman. But in reality, in terms of understanding this model and the idea of pulsation and orgasm as a regulatory function of pulsation, this individual is impotent because what's happening is there's no effective discharge. There's no effective relaxation. And it's true for women. I mean, you would see it differently in women, but essentially it's the same problem. So that in the social presentation of this actively, and we see this more and more in our society today, we see sex equals pornography or a mystical spiritual beauty. So this is probably the best American sort of morality tale around that, which is Blake Edwards' film 10 with Bo Derek. For those, everyone know that film? It's really, it's in one sense I remember as a kid thinking, as a young man, I was very hip. I thought, oh, this is a really dumb movie. But in fact, it's a profound morality tale. It's very, very close to the issue. It's really about all this, is that this guy, who's not happy in his life, although he has everything to be happy about, right? Essentially has these dreams about this ideal woman who he's going to meet and love and have sex with, and that the world is going to come to, an absolute, epiphanal, moment, and everything is going to be right, and everything is going to work, right? And of course, the gimmick is he goes off to find this, and he actually runs into her. And then the humor, of course, is that as he really makes contact with her, she turns out to be, she's physically everything he's dreamed of, but in fact, who she is this totally empty, idiot. She looked good, but the fact,
bolero.
what? And right, yeah, and he put, and the final joke, if you all remember, he puts on the bolero because that's the music he's always playing in his head when he's having sex.
Doesn't she insist she always wants to play
No,
bolero?
in the fantasy, the bolero is always playing as it reaches a climax, and she loves it. This is part of her symbol. In reality, when it happens, is that she says, "What this? Come on, let's." Basically, she's in a rush. She wants to get it over with, and she doesn't want the bolero. What's that stupid music you're playing? And it's like,
I remember from the movie is Bo Derek.
Yeah, the only thing you remember from the movies, but I actually remember Julie Andrews, who seemed wise, just as she had always been, and she had the little Bo Derek picture, which is, but the point is, that kind of movie represents really the fundamental problem with how we socially organize this kind of longing and this kind of and the kinds of dead ends that we wind up in, and the kinds of losses that we suffer because of our misunderstanding of natural function. Again, finally, in terms of my remarks, the final statement I want to make, and then we can open to questions. First, open to Dr. Schiff's response. Are you still there, Dr. Schiff? Yeah. Okay.
Wake up.
It's hard to tell because all we know from this is that there's a phone there and it's silent.
Right. Well, I keep it on mute while you're speaking.
Okay.
So it may take a moment then.
Okay. So to finish up for me on this was that. So what does this? Why would you have a society supporting the kind of view of sexuality that was inimical to actual healthy pulsation and function? Well, one of the things that Reich says in The Mass Psychology of Fascism very early on is that if you want individuals who are going to tolerate living in an essentially dysfunctional and unhealthy environment, performing acts and living on a daily basis in ways that are inherently repetitious, boring, uncomfortable, unpleasant, you're not going to achieve that by encouraging them to follow their natural pulsatory functions. For individuals who would be capable of experiencing their natural rhythms and self-regulating, could not get up at 7 o'clock each morning or earlier, 6 o'clock each morning, to get to work by 8:30 or 9 and work at jobs that are, no matter how fancy you want to put on how much money you make on it, really intolerable. They just simply couldn't do those kinds of things. They would not be able to, the organism could not tolerate it. So if you want to create individuals who are in various ways capable of tolerating such dysfunctional work patterns, such dysfunctional interpersonal relationships, such dysfunctional social behaviors, and also can tolerate kinds of authority and kinds of social organization that are, again, inimical to healthy function, you have to produce individuals who can tolerate a high level of discomfort. And that means that you cannot allow them to be in contact with actively their natural functions in some way. None of this is, and the mistake here also, it's easy to talk about this stuff and see this as a group of people sitting down and saying, okay, what we're going to do, this is not, it could be, it is a laboratory experiment with some people that we don't know about, from Star Trek really working on us. But in fact, this is not a laboratory experiment. It's not a bunch of guys sitting down and deciding that here's how we're going to, condition human beings. It is something that emerges out of really centuries and centuries of gradual alteration, gradual response, gradual reorganization of overall social behaviors. And the amazing thing is that orgasm function, or natural biological function, is a miraculously powerful device. It is, in a sense, the carrot on the stick. It's the thing that if you can create a society in which longing operates within each individual, and you keep sort of dangling promises in various ways of happier, healthier, prettier, nicer, this or that, people basically will move in those directions. So similarly, if you come up with ideas that here, take this pill and everything is going to be much better, people will do that because the impulse is, look, I want to feel better. I don't want to feel this kind of pain. I don't want to feel, and so essentially it comes down to, Reich's favorite, and from my remarks I think I would end here, my specific presentation, Reich's favorite anecdote or joke, right, which is, actually comes from A.S. Neal, as it turns out. Actually comes from Reich. A.S. Neal used to tell it as his favorite joke. It was really from Reich. Contrary to a lot of people who always assumed that Reich wasn't humorous. And I actually found out this was originally a Sufi morality tale. Anyways, Satan is in his domain, and a little devil comes running down from up above and says, Master, Master, there's been a disaster on earth. Right? And Satan leans back and says, what's the trouble, son? And the little devil says, Master, they've discovered the truth on earth. And Satan just smiles and says, oh, that's no problem. We'll just send someone up there to organize it. And that is the key to what this is. So that if sexuality, or if sexual function, or if the orgasm function is the central biological operation in nature for all organisms, and for humans particularly, in terms of our consciousness of it or our monitoring of it, if that is really essentially correct, then if you're going to organize individuals in a particular way, or encourage them to behave in a particular way that you have reason to want socially, then you're going to have to do that by controlling their access in one way or another to that natural function, or their experience of that natural function. And essentially, over centuries, more and more social organizations have learned how to manipulate that effectively, not consciously. So ironically, with the sort of explosion out of the 50s, out of the kind of repressed sexuality that many of us older folks lived with growing up, the sudden sort of availability of access to sexuality did not, in fact, lead immediately to a healthier, experience of the natural function, but led, in fact, to a more and more organized presentation of sexuality in a much more mechanical, pornographic presentation. So that it really is an alteration of behavior, but not a real liberation of behavior. Although there is a liberation there, in the sense that the controls of a number of decades, if not centuries, have been suddenly broken to some extent, and that we're still inheriting those patterns and that breakdown. In final comment, then, Reich describes this as really a problem of the way things have become layered. So as Reich describes it, there are really three layers. Right? There is, at the core, this fundamental pulsation, this fundamental natural function of expansion and contraction, and its expression through the organism biologically as what we would call the orgasm function, expansion, contraction, contraction operating in that way. And that's fundamental, and that's always at the core. However, when that function is altered and interfered with, as it has been for much longer than Reich even imagined, but certainly for hundreds of thousands of years in most societies, certainly in so-called advanced societies, when that function is altered and distorted and becomes organized in less operable ways, it becomes harder and harder to break. When you break it, contrary to what you would think, it doesn't suddenly move to the core. When you break down that kind of constriction, what breaks through are all is what Reich calls the second layer, the middle layer, which is all of the anger and rage and frustration and unhappiness and dissatisfaction and anxiety that produces when you began to close down, and when you began to control and give in to the controls that society imposed. That secondary layer is fearsome and frightening and dangerous. And so, and again, when someone comes along and says, well, the way to handle that is take this pill, or the way to handle that is to think of sexuality in this way, or follow this guru, or follow that guru, or follow this idea or that idea, we rush to it. It's a way of imposing order again, and being able to tolerate these uncomfortable, frightening behaviors, also to control our response to behaviors in other people that are expressed that way. So there is this impulse to try to reestablish control. Always in the top layer, the first layer that one really encounters, society is constantly trying to control the negative aspects of that middle layer, which are very frightening, very scary, leads to violence of various types, leads to misrepresentations of human relationship in various ways. And essentially, again, final anecdote was Reich's, and some of you have heard this before, Reich once asked all of the orgonomists that were gathered what they thought of the Catholic Church. Right? And of course, as they were often wont to do, their response was what they assumed Reich wanted, which was, "Oh, the Catholic Church is terrible. It's one of the great, evils in the world. It's destroyed human life." And Reich said, "I wouldn't want to live in a world without the Catholic Church." And they were all like, they didn't know what to make of that. Right?
It's only evil if you're Catholic.
He said he didn't want to live in a world without the Catholic Church. No. He didn't want to live in a world without the Catholic Church because that world, the Catholic Church, was one of the institutions that kept things ordered and functional, even at the loss of many people's lives. He said, on the other hand, of course, you're never going to get past that to a healthier social organization without breaking down institutions like the Catholic Church or other kinds of institutions, including the Communist Party or the Nazi Party or possibly the American political system, the Democrats too, the political system. It's really some of you who are subject to this really think that it's political parties and political organizations are social representations of a society that's designed to organize and keep control of these impulses to reorganize socially. And the goal, if possible, would be to reorganize socially in ways that are closer to these natural and less inimical to these natural functions. The problem with that, as it's very easy to sit on a Sunday or Saturday, whatever, and talk theoretically about this, the problem is that there'll be many, many horrible events along the way and many, many casualties and many, many people who fall by the wayside. And of course, for us, we don't want it to be us, and we don't really want it to be anyone we know. We want it to happen someplace, far away. I mean, one of the great things about the way war is becoming these days, not just in Iraq in general, is that you can, as long as you're at the center of the empire here, you can have wars in isolated areas that are, more removed, and you don't have to experience the actual horror of it. But the fact is, as the systems break down, they will require. It's not that the orgonomists are going to be, that we're going to all be called in to reorganize the world. It's not going to happen that way. And there's no absolute. One of the things you have to learn from this is there's no absolute predictive, quality of saying that it's all going to get reorganized in a way that I think or that Reich thought would be, effective. One of the last things he said in looking at what he called work democracy, which most people have an incredibly hard time understanding, is that he had no model for it. The simple reason was that it didn't exist yet, and you couldn't describe what it was until it emerged. You could talk about things that you might hope it presented or used, but in effect, you couldn't describe a system of organization that hadn't really emerged yet. And to do that would be the product of what all of these secondary layers and first layers were, rather these first layer institutions were. So that you could set up, if we set up work democracy or orgasmic health, Department of Orgasmic Health, it would be a disaster, right? Because the individuals running it would have some preconceived notion about what constituted orgasmic health, and the result would be, it would impose these ideas and these patterns on systems rather than letting them freely and naturally emerge. When we look at early social organization, one of my long-standing interests in anthropology has been not so much to talk about in quotes, primitive peoples or exotic ways of living, as much as understanding how human animals in nature organize their social behaviors. And when you look at humans in nature, one of the great lessons is that social organization is a product of daily life functions of the individuals. It's not the other way around. In our society, we experience social organization as what? As something that's imposed on us that we have to compulsively learn to operate within and perform and give back. You know, we have to learn how to be adult members and do all of present all the right behaviors. And if you don't, you suffer. You're going to be pushed out in some way, or you're going to be penalized in some way. If you're lucky, you'll be designated as an oddball artist or creative genius, and you'll get some rewards, but you'll also be maligned and misrepresented and written about in, the National Enquirer or something like that. Okay? So again, there is no absolute way of predicting how these natural functions would be organized, but that clearly the only way to get there would be to have an opportunity for these kinds of patterns to emerge and present themselves. And in terms of doing treatment, that certainly is what one tries to do when one works, clinically, which is to open the organism up enough so that these natural functions can find their own means of operating in the world. And granted, it's not going to be perfect because the world doesn't welcome you necessarily with open arms or present, you can become orgastically potent and orgastically functional, right? And still live in a world where, it's very, very hard to establish a healthy love life. And it's very hard to find a mate or sustain a mated relationship in a rational way. So that isn't necessarily just a simple step, but certainly you can bring individuals to a point where they function healthier and function more rationally and more, are able to be more self-regulatory, and then begin to struggle with the problems that exist in the society. So that's my presentation. I guess if Dr. Schiff, we can have his comments and then take questions. Unless there are any driving questions that need to be, there's usually a couple of people who have driving questions in this group. Yeah.
I need a comment.
Mm-hmm.
The version I heard,
Make it louder so Dr. Schiff could hear.
The version I heard of Dr. Reich's comments was, his doctors on the Catholic Church, was after they denounced it, he said, how many of you can handle the chaos that would ensue if it disappeared, which is really different.
Well, again, none of us would, my version comes from Dr. Sobey, and possibly he told the story differently depending, just as he would tell jokes differently depending on who he was telling it to. But why don't we let Dr. Schiff make some comments or make some remarks, and then we'll throw it to questioning. Okay?
Did you hear that?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, you good?
Yeah?
Go ahead. You're on.
There? Okay.
Okay.
Well, as usual, in many of these, Dr. Lewis covers a lot of the territory that I would initially also be drawn toward in speaking to the specific topic. So I just want to re-emphasize some of Dr. Lewis's points here that particularly ring true for me. This whole idea of the mystification of Reich's ideas and the longing that people have, and which then have drawn them to Reich, and then the mystification of that, I think, for me, is so central. So possibly what I see in terms of what brings people specifically to therapy who know about Reich, or some people who come to me have no idea of Reich's work. And then there are others who come to me specifically for Reich's work. And often with those people, there is a certain percentage, a certain population that comes with this intent that that healthy way of functioning kind of implied or had with it a deep connection to something that we often don't connect with in our lives. And this connection could be, or was read by me as a connection to two things. One, a connection to a kind of emotions, to our feelings, and then a connection to something cosmic, something that was beyond the person, the individual person, but something that was, you know, you could say cosmic orgone energy, or a cosmic connection, or a connection with nature. But in both of those, there was a sense of connection, a sense of contact, and which then was with a sense of yearning. Now, over the years in working with clients and living in life, one thing that has struck me is how often and how prevalent it is that these deep longings we have for connection are not actually actualized. And that inability to actualize that longing is, as Reich said, and that's what has kept me connected or involved with his work, is actually structuralized in our own psyche, soma, organism. And there's an unbearable tension there. A tension, a longing, a deep need to have this kind of contact. And then this unbearable kind of inability to have that. And that is continually driving us. And of course, you know, one could say that then leaks out into different kind of character symptoms or any kind of psychological symptoms or however one wants to look at that. But it is something that it deeply drives us in our behavior, in our thoughts, and our feelings. And Reich, I think, if one reads his work or the way I read his work, speaks to that. And then also began to speak to the idea that there's a way out of that. The way out of the trap. The way out of the armor. The way out of this prison. Some people feel that very deeply. Some people don't. For some people who come to therapy, I'm not in a prison. And in the process of being in therapy, they feel their own prison. They feel it because they kind of feel, hey, you know, I didn't realize I was so tight. I didn't realize I was so cut off from other people. I didn't realize that inside I felt so hurt or deeply sad or deeply detached. And then they feel their prison. But for other people, they come in with contact with that. They know about their own internal isolation. They know that their activities do not promote this sense of contact, connection, joy, internal sense of expansion. But in actuality, it's empty, it's lifeless, it's meaningless. And those people, again, long, as we all do, long for what this kind of connection is. And oftentimes come to Reich's ideas because he speaks to that. Now, as Dr. Lewis was saying, in actuality, he doesn't speak to that. He doesn't speak to it in the sense that he is not living or promoting this ideal or this idealization, this samadhi, this satori, this enlightened state, which we, often people, feel like this is the end goal. That he says, and correctly so, that is again a function of armor. It's a function of an overexpansion. You know, life has its ups and downs. To be healthy, whatever that word means, is to be pulsatory, and what that means is to be able to feel the range of experience, and a lot of experience doesn't feel that good. But so Reich never really, in essence, his theory of orgasm, you know, doesn't really embody it in an ideal, and yet, on the other hand, it does in his writings bring out a sense of promise. That if one can, in fact, become healthier in this certain kind of way, one will become able to have better contact with self and other. establish kind of idea of here is a place, and here is a flag in which demonstrates that the organism can itself accommodate different levels of excitation, expansion, contraction, and in a biological sense, that is going to support a person being able to have contact with self and with others. So that becomes mystified, that becomes something we yearn for, because in fact, it is so biologically powerful. So a person wants to have contact, wants to feel good, wants to feel released, but can't. Well, within the sexual act, oftentimes the energy is high enough that one can feel some level of that. And so, it becomes something that becomes a driving kind of force. However, it also can be a very empty experience. So we clearly, in our society, in many societies, become attached to the orgasm and become attached to the sexual function. But in reality, for me, I think what we're looking for is we're looking for this very deep kind of emotional connection with ourselves and with others. And when we don't have that, we continually to strive for that in one kind of mechanical or mystical pursuit or another. Now, this idea fits very well with what Dr. Lewis was saying. And I liked his kind of presentation of, and kind of a quote of Reich, of which you're thirsty, but you haven't really drank, and then that becomes, in a way, what you're yearning for, and then how pleasurable it is when you finally get it. And it really fits with this idea, which I think emerged from Reich's ideas in terms of tension, charge, discharge, relaxation, but was put into another frame that Fritz Perls used in terms of what becomes figural and what becomes in the ground. And he was kind of applying Gestalt perception ideas, and the whole idea is that something emerges in your perception, and that remains as a figural concept. That remains as something that we are perceiving and wanting to move toward. And then when that becomes satisfied, it recedes into the ground. So, if you're very thirsty, you remain thirsty because the pressure of that thirst becomes figural to you. And then when you drink, it's taken care of and it recedes. We're not continually thirsty unless we have some sort of thirst disorder. So in a similar kind of sense, the unmet longing for contact, the unmet longing for release, the unmet ability to experience pleasure, all of that pushes and remains in one level or another figural to us. And because we cannot meet that, it can never recede into the background. So, as Reich would say, though he wouldn't say it in those words, we continually have sex on our mind, whatever sex represents. We have continually have this wanting and yearning for some sort of pleasure or some sort of connection. It's continually on our minds. And so we create all these kind of ways of trying to satisfy it. But we can't satisfy it because we don't have the capacity to have that drink of water and really take it in. So that then, again, drives this kind of mystification of the orgasm, the mystification of sexuality, in the sense that it continually remains figural. So just two other comments with that. In terms of this whole idea of what led to the resistance of his ideas and those people who have mystified his ideas and the idealization of his ideas. And I've just been playing with my own ideas around this. And I think very often, Reich's ideas let me just try to put it into a frame. Reich would say that we all suffer from pleasure anxiety. It's another way of looking at it. What is that?
A little louder, please.
Reich would say that we all suffer, or part of what happens when pulsation is disturbed, or probably part of what leads to pulsation being disturbed, is that we suffer from pleasure anxiety. realized is because pleasure became linked in some way with fear, because of the response of the environment to our own pleasurable activity at some point in our lives, usually early on, these become bound together. And therefore, when we begin to have pleasure, we then have anxiety, and then we resist it. So, he spoke a lot. He spoke to this idea of pleasure, anxiety. And therefore, one could see that when Reich would speak so much about the sexual function or this whole idea of pleasure, some people would resist it tremendously because it unconsciously evoked their anxiety. Now, another word that Reich didn't use, but I think fits into this, is that there was not only pleasure, anxiety, but pleasure and shame. Shame, probably, maybe even kind of, not the word is kind of, anxiety would be part of that. That our own experiences of pleasurable activity became not only linked with fear, but linked with shame. Shame being a different aspect, but having the similar kind of function in terms of fear, in terms of it leads to a contraction, moving away from. And we know that those things that we feel shame about, we do not want presented in public. Therefore, if that is the case, it also makes sense why his ideas, speaking about the orgasm, speaking about sexuality, in such a kind of, this is like eating, this is part of life, would lead some people to essentially want to get rid of it. Don't expose my shame to the world. Don't expose me to shame. But I also think at the underside of shame is narcissism, a counter shame. Not only am I going to expose my shame, that thing that makes me ashamed, I'm going to then highlight it. It makes me feel better. It's kind of almost like a counterphobic kind of response. So there are those people who, underneath, they feel shame, but they deal with it by embracing that which they're ashamed and denying their shame. And then they become larger in that way, rather than really feeling the smallness that's there. So I think, I've thought about this, that oftentimes these individuals that really embrace Reich's work, or embrace his ideas about sexuality, or the way it's construed, and then feel big about it. They feel identified with it. They feel, I'm a Reichian. I know the truth about this. These people are, like many of us, driven by this shame, but in their own character structure, defend against that by this kind of becoming idealizing it, undoing it in terms of a narcissistic act. Then they become better rather than smaller. Then they become, rather than having something that they feel they want to shrink from, they put it out into public. And yet, at the core of that is that underneath they still don't feel comfortable with really what's at the essence of it. So, I guess to conclude this, and it's always interesting for me to kind of give these kind of talks in this situation because I'm talking without any contact at all with you. So and I do a lot of teaching and stuff, but often when I'm teaching I have some feedback, so I have no sense as I'm speaking in terms of where you are with this. How does this resonate with you? How it doesn't? Maybe afterwards we can speak a little about it. But here I'm talking about contact, but speaking in a totally, for me, a contactless kind of environment here. So, but with that, so if I ramble for a moment because I'm not getting this kind of feedback here, let me just say, so to sum it up here, to kind of sum up, I think we have the issues of contact, connection, yearning for connection, the kind of thing that bringing ourselves into our organism and the whole aspect of orgasm kind of yearns and pulls for. We have a desire for pleasure. we have a desire for those things that have been linked with anxiety and shame to be undone because they're natural. Okay? And we have a desire for release, which is the orgasm function. Okay? And those are all those things that pull us, that push us to make orgasm and to make some of Reich's ideas central and foreground. And at the same time, we become structurally, becomes difficult to really achieve that. And so then we either mystify or devalue it. But on both hands, it's because of our inability to really make that contact. And just to kind of sum that up, I mean, that becomes a real guiding kind of principle for me. And I've been doing more work with couples over the past number of years. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that because in essence, what it is that I get a chance to really see both the yearning for contact and the way that people can't get it. It's almost like, I mean, that's one of the great things about working with groups or working not just individually in a one-on-one therapeutic situation, is you begin to see how people in the world thwart their own attempt to have this connection which they yearn for. And that's what I see repeatedly. In one way or another, each individual is expressing, I want to be close. I want to feel connection. I want to feel connection to my own feelings. I want to be loved by you. I want to be valued by you. I want to value you. And simultaneously, as they're voicing that, they're doing the opposite. So it is something that because of our learning, because of our growing up, because of our societal influences, or how a society is represented in the family, or vice versa, it is something that we become unable to achieve, and yet we continually are yearning to achieve. So I look forward to your responses, and I hope that if I was there, I would not see kind of drooping eyes and people kind of retracting and rolling their eyes,
Let's send them back some contact.
Okay.
Yay, we love it, we love it.
Yes, beautiful.
We love it, we love it. I feel such contact.
Of course, the problem is that you and David Silver have to organize a technological breakthrough and get this on a screen. But that's up to you. You computer whizzes. Although David Silver says that it's too complicated and costly.
Yes, I think the finances are probably
but this is at least we've come this far.
Yeah.
Anyway, in fact, no one fell asleep. Maybe it's the coffee that we've all been drinking. Anyway, the only thing I wanted to. I did have something I wanted to add, but it'll come up again. In talking about how society tends to misread a lot of the nature of sexuality in following up that theme. Anecdotally, there's people I worked with, anthropologists I worked with, who had done a lot of work with the Bush people in the Kalahari, performed a sort of impromptu experiment of when they went back at one point, they brought copies of Playboy, to show to Bush people. And the Bush people thought it was the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. Of course, it had nothing to do with the fact that they were naked women or that it was about, in our terms, our obsession with sexuality. They just thought it was interesting. They couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in pictures of people who were naked. They thought it was the silliest, the most, it was just funny. They just thought it was a funny thing, which proved, as far as they were concerned, how crazy these outsiders were who were coming in. Is that this is what you spend your time doing, looking at magazines with pictures of naked women. So again, it has a lot to do with our of what happens when you're trapped. Again, so let me then throw it open to the group here and try to. If you can hear, that's fine. If not, I'll translate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. To a certain extent, I feel like I'm in a group of blind people who are trying to identify an elephant, and each by feeling different parts of the elephant.
So which part are you on?
Well, I'm going to get to that. Reich's account of his experience in Russia, as I recall, is that the reason that he became disenchanted and left, that after he had been there for a while, the leader, and I think it was Lenin, but he never identifies him by name, says, Dr. Reich, we really like you. And the reason that we like you is that you give us permission to fuck as much as we want.
But that wasn't Lenin. Lenin was very, very anti-sexual.
Whatever. Now, I don't know who it was, but whoever it was, this is what Reich said. He said to him, and that the drink of sex as a drink of water was on the Russian side. That they felt that they were making sexuality nothing, just like a drink of water. And Reich felt that this was entirely contrary to whatever he was trying to teach them. So he left Russia.
No, the remark about, to clarify, the remark about you give us permission to fuck came from a low party functionary,
I don't know where it came from.
and Reich found that very, very offensive, and basically argued that essentially the problem in the Soviet Union, in his the sexual revolution and a visit to the Soviet Union, found that that in fact they were operating from the top down, in the sense of seeing it as essentially giving permission to be sexually promiscuous,
Right.
rather than, and that this was a problem in the sexual communes of the 20s, in general throughout Germany and the Soviet Union. But the comment on the glass of water had to do with a defense against one of his associates there, who was Vera Schmidt, who ran the child development program and was under attack for advocating a kind of view of sexuality that was reducing, that in fact one of the things that Reich says in his visit to, his essay called The Visit to the Soviet Union, is that the problem in the Soviet Union is that the leadership really is as morally, sex negative, except they take the posture of being much more liberal, and they're capable of fucking, and that in fact he predicted as early as the late 20s that in fact they weren't addressing real changes in male-female interactions and in genuine liberation. That he predicted that what was really going to happen, what he saw already, was that they gave permission for women to be more sexually open and available, but basically at home they were still performing all the roles of traditional women, and that this was going to fail in terms of child rearing and stuff. So no, it wasn't his disdain with and his attacks on the Soviet system and the Communist Party were based really on their reinstituting of this sex morality, this compulsive sex morality, in very much the way Dr. Schiff is saying, which is that we have the real truth, and we're not going to be like those guys. We're just rewrapping the old stuff in a new package.
The other thing that I wanted to mention is that in my recollection, Reich's writings, he theorized that the energy for neurosis came from dammed up sexual energy that was not released.
Energy, not sexual energy. Sexual. There is no such thing as sexual energy in Reich's
dammed up
model.
energy that was not released.
Yeah.
And I would, if that's the case, and it's you can release energy by simply emptying your bladder, where are all these neurotic people in the world coming from? Is all they have to do is urinate, and they go, and they're finally released energy.
That's an
and
analogy.
We should be living in a wonderful world. Obviously, we're not.
Well, even taken literally, obviously, the pleasure one experiences from eating, drinking, or urinating, or defecating, or any natural function is limited. It's specific to that act, for one, and for two, it assumes that your pleasure, there are people who are blocked in that. Plus, as David Silver was saying, it is an analogy. It's not to say that urinating is exactly the same as sexual union,
I understand.
except for some people who have serious blocks. That's a whole
imagine
other.
an armored bladder.
Right. But in fact, that is true. There are individuals who suffer profound blockage of other natural functions, and again, because what you're really touching on right, is exactly the confusion of what Reich is talking about, which is it's not about sexual energy, which is often what is assumed Reich is talking about. He never uses that term. It is what happens when energy gets blocked. One of the things that happens when energy gets blocked is that it interferes with all ranges of function in the organism, including sexual, which is a deep central function, right? And all other biological functions, which often, that's why Freud himself had originally assumed that sexuality informed all sorts of aspects of function. So when we treat pathology, individuals who are often blocked, in terms of their interpersonal relationships, ability to have deep contact and have deep sexual gratification, also have urinary problems, also have, defecation problems, eating disorders, constipation, all sorts of disruptions. So it's not that one is, it's what happens when the energy is blocked can express itself. Again, when you have, it's that image that Reich offers again of a stream that's flowing straight that gets blocked. You can predict that the water is going to spill and there's going to be disruption of the natural flow. You cannot predict exactly how and when and where it's going to break through and what the angles that it will take or the rerouting that will take will depend on the terrain, on the circumstances. So in some cases it can flood to the left, some cases it can flood to the right, some cases it floods back, some cases it smashes through and destroys whole, area. So all you can do is talk about what happens. You know that if you have a blockage, right, something is going to be disrupted. You can't tell where or how. And generally speaking, when we talk about human organisms or animal organisms, when there's a blockage, it's going to disrupt the full range of functions to one degree or another. Any comment out there?
Can I jump in here for a moment?
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure if I'm following this. I'm not sure if I'm following
Me neither.
whether or not what's an analogy and what is not an analogy. It seems to me that the function of defecation or urination or eating or drinking water, it's not analogous.
Right.
It is an energy function.
Right, that's right.
It is, and so much of what we're doing is an energy function. Pulsation is occurring continuously in different elements of our organism, in different behavioral responses. Okay, so here I am, I'm walking back and forth, listening to this, and having some anticipation and build up in terms of when am I going to speak and what am I going to say. We could look at that in terms of an energy function of building up of tension, a coalescing of that within some sort of ideation, and now an expression and a release of that, which has a certain kind of physiological aspect, is expressed physiologically and has a feeling state. There is in me, just as there is in children when they get excited about something and then they scream and yell, tension, charge, discharge, relaxation. That is occurring. It occurs in all kind of creative activities. And it occurs in things that we feel moved and moved by. It does not occur, or it occurs in very small ways in those repetitious mechanical acts, and then we don't feel the release or the pleasure of it. So the energy function is happening all the time. What is unique and what Reich felt about the orgasm is that that encompasses the whole organism in a total pulsation. Okay, so when we urinate or defecate, we are not giving or not, whole organism is not involved in that in the totality that the whole organism is involved in that during the orgasm. That's the whole idea of Reich's understanding of looking at the orgasm reflex as the movement in the body, which indicates that there's enough armoring that is diminished so that you can give over to that sense of pleasure, release, and energetic discharge. So that's where, if you're speaking about that in terms of analogies or not analogies, I don't see anything analogous. I think we're actually speaking about,
Yes.
in a sense, something very concrete.
Yeah, I think that's the point. In fact, it really is the point that Reich always makes of common functioning principle. It's not analogous, it is the same functioning principle in all these cases. It's just experienced in different ways at different times depending on the circumstances. And certainly the thing about the sexual, an effective embrace, and often people get, Dr. Sobey always used to become irate, as a number of you who knew him remember when people said making love. I made love. He said, what, you made love? That's like you made a cake, or you made,
You said you couldn't make love.
You couldn't make love. So the issue is, and some people think we're being extreme in saying, when you embrace, which is when two organisms fully embrace and come in contact and experience a release systemically, it tends to organize the whole experience, it tends to organize the whole body, as opposed to other kinds of functions which are more localized, more generalized, although you experience them if you're open to them. So to use the urination example, if you experience release of the bladder and the pleasure of that, it is experienced over the whole system. It's just not as overwhelming or as fully, it's not as intense. Plus, it tends to be a more solitary, experience, and therefore specific to your own, individual need at the time. So that I think what Dr. Schiff is saying is that it's really not a matter of difference or analogy as much as kinds of behaviors that are all organized. The common functioning principle really is not sex, which is where I think the Freudians initially made the mistake of assuming that sex operates through everything, which is that it's biological pulsation, it's natural pulsation, which organizes all of our experience.
Yes,
Sexuality is a specific expression of that that's quite intense and probably has much greater significance in our lives because of the fact that we have more problems with it.
Right, but from my understanding is that the point of Reich's function of the orgasm was that this was the most economical way of discharging the most energy and keeping your energy economy at a certain level.
It was the most effective. It was
Right.
it was the most central and effective means for regulating
Right.
the natural pulsation. I think also the other great error often in this work is to assume that the goal is to discharge. Getting it out, coming, the big O it fails to understand that there are 4 steps to this whole, function, which is, relaxation, charge, peak, discharge. Every one of those steps has its place and has its role, and the issue of discharge only becomes significant when you can't discharge, when there's a disturbance in the discharge.
But the discharge is where the pleasure is. The build-up,
Not necessarily. The pleasure, if you want to really, and this is not just right, extreme, Dr. Schiff mentions the Gestalt work, particularly Heffernan, who is one of the researchers who lent a lot of his research in biophysical, psychological function, shows that pleasure is often experienced in Reich's in terms of what we're talking about. The pleasure is in the healthy, uninterrupted, and basically functional experience of the whole function of relaxation, tension, charge, discharge. It only becomes disturbed when it gets blocked in one or a number of those areas. So if it's blocked in the discharge phase, it's going to produce certain problems. There are other individuals where it gets blocked in the tension phase and doesn't move much beyond that. It's going to produce a certain set of problems. But if it's really working, the pleasure is in a sense of it not noticing it. It's sort of like if it's not broke, don't fix it. So if I have people come to me, and after a while, and anyone who's done this kind of clinical work sees this, there are individuals who come to me who have some problems in their lives. Obviously that's bringing them into treatment, and then you talk to them for a while, you work with them for a while, you realize, you're functioning pretty well. Your biggest problem is that you can't find someone to go out with. You haven't found a good relationship, and they find that, and suddenly they say, I'm feeling pretty good. But they don't really, it's not that they know that, now I have the big, I'm having, the function of the orgasm is working, is that they just experience greater ease in their life. It's working. So I think most of us who get really, and myself included, all of us, who get really tied up in all of this is because to some degree or other we're dealing constantly with how it doesn't work, where there's some problem. If it's working, Dr. Sobey always said, and Reich says this also, that we probably never really encounter, most of us, anyone who's really genital or healthy in that sense, or where the orgasm function is really working, because they won't come in to therapy. Because they don't have a great need. Sometimes they come in only because something practically in life has created a barrier or a block, and then, someone could be experiencing, a block, but that is situational. And those are the easiest ways sometimes, because then you can say, well, it's the old Mel Brooks routine, which is, the guy, he talks about the psychiatrist who cures the problem. The kid is compulsive tearer of paper. And they take him to every psychiatrist they can find, and no one can solve it. And finally, they take him to Dr. Heinrich, whatever, in Germany, the specialist. And for $50,000, he stops the problem. Takes the kid into the room. He walks out. The kid never tears paper again. Parents pay another $50,000 because they have to find out, what did you do? And he says, what did I do? I told them, that's stupid. Stop tearing paper. So it should be, in a sense, Brooks was picking up on the fact that on one level, if it's really simple, then that's not where the problem lies. The kind of things we're talking about have to do with how armored or blocked organisms, where there's a disruption, when there's a disruption of the pulsation, whether it's in urination or whether it's in sex, there's going to be a problem. It's going to affect the organism. Kelly?
What you were just saying is what I was going to say. I followed everything everybody was saying, and I recently read The Function of the Orgasm before coming to today's lecture.
Aha, good.
And so it made it easier to follow. But it was easiest to follow when I followed right through to the orgasm. When you talk about the big O, discharge, that's the problem. Because that interrupts the whole flow.
That's right. Absolutely. Couldn't have said, that's the best statement. It's matter of fact, almost everybody who ever has described problems with orgasm invariably experience the problem when they when the system is on sort of automatic and going, and then you start saying, well, is it going to be okay? Is it going to happen now? I'm almost there. It's going to happen. As soon as you start thinking about it, it's over. And Norman, who was raising it, you're a musician, and what jazz musicians always used to say, right, is that when someone is in the groove and really going, if they start thinking about how much they're in the groove, it's over.
Like athletes too.
That's athletes too, right? As soon as you start saying, I'm really there, right?
It's like I'm
going to really,
it's like any art.
It's like anything, artists. I'm really doing it. As soon as you become. And that is a response really to the tension that's building up, and it becomes, as Dr. Schiff was saying, anxiety. Instead of going to just continuing to function and continuing to flow, it becomes you can't deal with it at some level. Your organism
It's a way to stop it because
right.
you don't want to do it.
Because you can't, not because you don't want to. Actually, the problem is you want to. Your organism is crying out for it. But and as Dr. Schiff was also saying, it usually goes back to deep childhood experiences where anything like that was very, very threatening on a variety of levels. It's not just because you had a bad mother. It could be that you were taken away from your mother, at a time when you really were feeling very, very great deal of pleasure. It could be any number of disruptions that have become, endemic and chronic. And become embedded, and that's what becomes very, very hard to change. Yeah.
I just,
Well,
So in a sense, the ideal thing is when things are functioning properly, you forget about yourself.
That's right. Or you're with yourself, and you don't have to think about yourself. It's not so much you forget about yourself; you don't have to think about yourself. Well, forgetting about yourself, at least to me, has always meant in a certain sense of losing the self, or in sort of the Buddhist, sort of sense of, getting beyond the self. But in the way I think of this is that you're present enough with the self is so operative that it's no longer an impediment. that it doesn't prevent you from the expression's going with the flow, just giving in, and sort of, sort of moving with it, I think is crucial. And certainly one of the appeals of, say, Buddhism or these kinds of things are the sense of loss of self, or moving, or surrendering, are images I think we are central throughout all of our cultures. Whereas in simple hunting and gathering societies, not that they don't have fights and have issues and arguments, is that they don't get the idea of why people worry so much about what's happening, because they tend to, as most animals do, live in the moment. So it's again Reich's image of, a dog is sleeping on the floor, you accidentally kick it, right? It jumps up, it gets ready for, to defend itself, it gets ready to deal with whatever threat is occurring, right? But as soon as you make sure that it understands it was an accident and everything is all right, if it's a healthy dog, it basically goes back to sleep or lies down or gets its toy to play with you, whatever, because it figures, well, as long as you got me up, you might as well do something with it. But in a sense, it's healthy, and we laugh at that because we all understand how right that is. The problem is we also all understand how little in most of our lives we live that way. And some of it's, and then we get into the social ramifications of that, how little in our lives, in our society allows us to live that way. Because most of what we have to do is compulsive. Do you have any comments out there?
Well, I have plenty of comments. There's so much to react to and everything that's being said. I think it is, first of all, one of the things I was reacting to earlier is your very important kind of statement that the pleasure is not just at the end.
Right.
That the whole sense of going with the whole flow of it, as we're speaking now, giving over to the whole process is where the pleasure is. The pleasure might feel differently at different stages.
Right.
We might call one excitation. We might call one excitement. We might call one a kind of an interest. The other might, at the end, call it a kind of relief. We might call it a dissolving. But it's all different ways in which we experience this pleasure of the total cycle. And I think, of course, different people get stopped, immobilized at different places in this cycle. And then so we can have disorders in terms of arousal, or in terms of disorders in terms of discharge. Whether or not we're talking in the actual orgasmic function, or we're talking in the ability to conceive an idea, to follow through with an idea, to give birth to an idea. And in any way we can have disruptions at different parts, but it really
Speaking
is...
of this